Hello, and welcome to Today in Geography, a podcast produced by the Department of Geography, Environment, and Spatial Sciences at Michigan State University. Each episode, we talk with members of our community about their research and their interests, and then we spend some time spotlighting events and celebrations that have shaped the field of geography. I'm Nathan Moore, an associate professor in the department, and your host for an engaging exploration of people, places, and stories that shape our world. Today, we're observing National Homeless Persons Memorial Day, an event organized by the National Coalition for the Homeless, the National Consumer Advisory Board, and the National Health Care for the Homeless Council to encourage communities to host public events on or near the winter solstice on December 21st to remember their neighbors who have died homeless in the past year. But more about that later in our show. First, I'm joined by Stephen Przybylinski, an urban geography professor in our department. Stephen, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's get into a little bit about how you became a geographer. What's your superhero background story?
The superhero background story, sure. Well, I think it probably comes down to teaching, really good teaching in undergraduate. I had an excellent urban geography instructor at University of Minnesota. His name was Roger Miller. He actually passed away when I was finishing my last year in a sort of unfortunate motorcycle accident. Nonetheless, that incentivized me to look into what graduate school was all about, and some of his TAs sort of helped along that process. And so it was really instrumental in showing me what was so amazing about urban geography as this broader field of landscape, architecture, history, preservation, design, planning, with a social justice bent. So I think that's probably where it really started. I was unaware of what geography was really before.
Like so many of us.
Like so many. Before actually taking it. So, yeah.
Isn't geography just making maps? So you thought, okay, maybe I should go into grad school.
That's right. So I double majored in urban studies and geography, which Minnesota kind of bundles together as a bachelor's. And talking with enough TAs there and sort of the urban studies coordinators, it became clear that, your interest might actually be satisfied to go into a graduate program. You might want to think around and talk to other advisors about what that might look like. At the time, I was really interested in urban wind energy and sort of the scale of what urban wind energy could allow for in certain places, like Minneapolis I was thinking about. So that's who I was reaching out to in graduate programs, and total 180 from what I'm doing now. But nonetheless, these are sort of the ideas I was working with and the themes I was really interested in geography then.
Okay, and so now I see you doing work with homeless. You've got a book out, and you started moving in a different direction. Can you tell me a little bit about how you moved from that point and what sort of constants you had, like, that keeps it geographical?
Yeah. So I think the pivot was actually being in a place that had a lot of unsheltered people in it. So when I got to graduate school at Portland State in Portland, Oregon, there was not only a large visible unhoused population on the streets there, but there was one particular encampment in downtown Portland that was occupying a corner in the central business district, which sort of like really piqued my geographic priors,
why
right?
Here and not somewhere.
Yes, why here? How could this be allowed in the United States, where normally the police would come and tear this apart instantly, and business interests would move in to make sure this couldn't operate next to them. The city would get involved, and certainly all of those things did happen as I started to involve myself in this one encampment, which was called Right to Dream. They still exist today, actually, in a different location. But I think it was that kind of walking in these downtown spaces and seeing a lot more of visible homelessness that started to pique my interest a little bit more academically about who was addressing it. I'd probably read a few things in the geography literature too about it, which I think is then made that connection for me. There is a geographic approach to understanding and examining homelessness. It's not this sort of all political thing that you see in the media, where it's constantly kind of push and pull with city governments, pushing in homeless encampments around or out, eradicating them, or asking people to move. There is a sort of spatial element to it as well. And so in my master's then, I actually was doing some pretty basic mapping, I would say, about like where encampments are, access to resources around those encampments through some cluster mapping, and just basically understanding the world of unhoused encampments, and why they are where they are within the city, where they're located within zones, for instance, like industrial versus commercial, that sort of thing. But since then, I've gotten a little more into the social justice aspect of it. That's really rich in human geography, especially in the 80s and 90s, the geographic approaches to understanding why unhoused people are in public space, forced to voluntarily or involuntarily, live their lives out in public space, and how certain things like capital and city governments or governance structures combine to sort of work to force out people from public spaces. And then what is the result of that? The sort of geographic question is, where do we go? Where are we allowed to be in this world of highly regulated public and private spaces? And so my work on property, really what my dissertation fieldwork was about, was understanding the complexity of how property relationships and property rights and laws really overlay with unhoused people's lives. So how can you exist in these spaces when all of these regulations are put in place to kind of ensure that these behaviors and actions don't exist?
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's very much the where and the why. That's
The where and the why.
Talk about geography.
Yeah.
There are some peculiarities about Portland that make it a very interesting place to look at homelessness and zoning. Can you share a little bit about Portland's peculiarities?
Yeah, there's a few. There's land use is a big issue in Oregon historically. Over the last, let's say, since the early 70s, Portland and Oregon, the state of, have had a really progressive approach toward land use planning. In the mid 70s, all municipalities in Oregon had an urban growth boundary instituted around them.
All of them. I just thought it was.
Yeah, it's all of them, which limits the growth, of course, of suburbanization and sort of meant to prevent mass suburban sprawl and sort of ex-urban sprawl. And that sort of limits what gets built outside of the city, of course. That then has its effect on the densification of a place, for instance. What can be built where. The city has gone through a few rounds more recently of rezoning, where they upzone certain districts, like single-family home districts, for instance, now can be made more dense with the proper permits. So that's one of the unique things about Oregon. I think the other thing is the city of Portland, for up until this year, basically had a commission form of government, which meant they had 5 council members, the mayor being one equal to the others, that represented really no district. They were just at-large members. And so there was a lot of power and equity in how decisions were made about all things related to planning and public policy. But in terms of homelessness, that was all guided by 5 people who were generally kind of more well-off, established political figures.
Maybe detached from certain geographical spaces.
Detached from probably the reality of a lot of low-income, of low-income housing spaces, particularly on the east side of the city. And as of this year, there's now a 12-member council. There was a what was it called? A ballot to have the city vote on how they wanted to expand the commission. And now it's a kind of classic weak mayor system of 12 representatives. So those areas in East and North Portland, which historically have been low income, mostly people of color, have representation now. And so that will actually be really interesting to follow how that affects then housing in those areas, homelessness services in those areas, taxes, all sorts of things, schooling. So yeah, there's a lot of things that make Portland unique outside of what we even see in the media about Portland as a place.
Well, there's a whole TV series too.
So that's right.
So, can you tell me a little bit more about then your PhD program and what came out of some of that work?
Yeah, so I went to Syracuse for my PhD. Syracuse basically has an all-human geography faculty, and so people really are going there for.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, people are really going there for critical human geography research. And historically, it's been focused a lot on cultural geography from the 70s and the 80s. There's some really big names. And that is still present there. But there was also a lot of political ecologists and even Marxist scholarship that was going on there when I got there as well. And so a lot of the faculty were very much on the side of sort of critical side of human geography, whether it be cultural, political, urban. And that mixed together, and my cohort's mix of students were very focused on that, not sort of what is going on the everyday level, but how might we change systems to help eradicate these problems that we're looking at. And so my advisor that I worked with had other students who were also working on homelessness projects throughout the country in different sorts of ways, through oral history, ethnography. And it was a really vibrant space for me to think through these sorts of issues with a lot of the students there, because they're so focused on similar sorts of issues within critical geography. So it was a great place to hone in on what exactly I was thinking about, not just about homelessness, but about why property is this larger social system that creates these really enmeshed inequities that require this sort of surgical undoing to make sense of. And and I had great advisorship to make that happen there.
And then, so then you finish your dissertation, and then what was the next step after that?
Next step was a postdoc in Sweden, and I was applied to work on a grant that has nothing to do with homelessness. It was called the JustNorth grant. I'm sure there was some subtitle to it, but JustNorth, which basically was this multi-institution grant with maybe up to 70 team members throughout maybe 15 universities in the Arctic. Pretty expansive, multiple groups working at different times on different pieces. What I was working on with a group of 7 was sort of the conceptual framing of the project. And I think the stated goal of the project was to identify ethical and just development protocol or mechanisms to understand development projects specifically in the Arctic. So whether that be rural and or urban Arctic, the idea was to sort of create this, I don't want to say matrix, but this list of ways that we might approach development projects by pulling in people to understand the ethics behind their actions. And that could be, for instance, a major corporation and what sort of the environmental implications of their development might be. In Siberia, for instance, it might involve indigenous groups who live in the area and how they might be impacted by Arctic development. And then ecosystems that are involved in this. So it wasn't just human, but also non-human aspects of development and how development affects the Arctic in general. So that was kind of a very much different from everything I was doing before that, except for it was very trained on what we were doing in our working group on justice literatures, trying to devour as much justice literature as possible as we could, discuss it. But then the challenge was taking that information and then communicating that with the other working groups who were not in the traditional social sciences. They were physical geographers. We had legal scholars. There might have been an economist or two in there. And so taking that information about justice theory and then translating that into like legal policy, for instance, very short sort of bullet point takeaways about what more just and ethical development might look like was part of that task. So that was new to me, a bit challenging to try and think in those new ways.
And integrative too, because you have to
Totally.
think about those other pieces, right?
Yeah, that made it a lot of fun at the same time. It's nice to stay in your bubble, but it's nice to be shaken out of it too.
Yeah, I remember my first few months of my postdoc, I was like, this is completely different.
Yeah,
It's good. It pulls you into new things you didn't know you could do.
yeah.
Okay, and then a little bit of time in Sweden, and then what?
So Sweden, and then after 2 years in Sweden, I started at Michigan State here in the Department of Geography. And so this is the beginning of my fourth year. Beginning of my fourth year, which is kind of crazy to think about. Time goes by. And here I've been continuing research on homelessness as well as justice, kind of pursuing an analytical approach to justice within geography, which is sort of ebbed and flowed throughout the decades. And me and some colleagues are trying to work on, kind of advancing those ideas about what does justice actually mean when we think geographically more recently. And then teaching-wise, I've been teaching urban geography courses. I'll be teaching Introduction to Urban Studies soon here within geography, which will be a lot of fun to try and expose more people to urban geography and geographic perspective on urbanization. And then cultural geography, I've taught before, economic geography, so very much within the human side of things. But I've also enjoyed teaching ISS courses here too, which is when I get to talk about the politics of climate change and what actually is changing climate. How do we measure that? What does that mean for society in the ISS courses that we teach? So yeah, it's been a good spread. And, all of that is drawing on my training in graduate school and postdoc. And so
when I think about urban spaces, like if I could ask you to pull out a couple of your experiences or times when your geography worldview was really helpful, like walking through Stockholm, are there a couple of instances you can think of that would sort of illustrate how a geographer sees urban spaces?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Like everywhere I go, I'm constantly sort of thinking about silly things like kickbacks or setbacks rather from buildings from the streets, right? Like a classic design principle where in an American downtown, there'll be the buildings right up basically to the sidewalk. And if they're built in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they're not really that inviting towards the public. That public design needs to be intentional. And so you find these spaces a lot more times in European cities, even in places like Istanbul, where there's these great open spaces where people seem to be thriving, living out their lives in public. And maybe you see that a little bit less here in the United States. There's still successful examples of that here. But it's through those sort of comparison through difference that you start to realize how people have purposely, intentionally created spaces to recreate social spaces of recreation and enjoyment.
Car-centered versus
Oh my God, yeah. If you take East Lansing, for example, to where I was in Uppsala, Sweden, there are a few bike lanes here. There really aren't dedicated bike lanes. There's maybe sort of one through campus that's extended sometimes, and how dedicated it is. Yeah. But it's just a norm in European society, for instance. So I could bike through the entire city on a single speed bike, in 10, 15 minutes. And there's dedicated lights just for the bikes. And it made it easy, less dangerous. You don't have to think about it. But that was all intentional, right? That's planned into the fabric of the city so that it reflects the social ideals about what people want in their urban spaces.
And so maybe Michigan being being the car state, maybe we foreground cars and we just ignore the walkability of these.
Yeah, and there's some cities that have done well in this. Portland and Minneapolis, for instance, have pretty good biking infrastructure where there are dedicated lanes. Sometimes cars park away from curbs, so bikers go in between that, which helps buffer ongoing traffic. So there's ways to do it, but yeah.
So, you mentioned Portland as a place where you have a lot of experience and homelessness, but are there other cities that have different, I don't even know how to ask this question, different kinds of homelessness?
I think I know what you mean by that. Homelessness is such a complex problem that there's a social aspect to it, there's a cultural aspect to it, there's a legal, political aspect to it. One place that I would highlight is really interesting. Well, I can highlight a couple. Chicago actually has probably the most robust homeless bill of rights in the country, meaning that unhoused people who exist, say, in downtown Chicago actually have more rights to be protected against sort of the massive sweeps that we might see a city do, meaning that they won't be necessarily criminalized for being outside when they have nowhere else to go. It's just kind of a stronger burden to bear for the state to say, you don't have this right to be here, we have the right to remove you. So that's kind of unique for a large city like that.
Yeah.
And the West Coast cities don't really have that. It's also a geography dimension and a climate dimension. And you just can't exist outside in Chicago like you can in a place like Houston. Houston's really interesting as well because there's simultaneously more conservative land use laws about what unhoused people are allowed to do, with also very liberal land use laws about what property owners can do. And so that meshing doesn't actually work very well for unhoused people getting stable. But Houston has been really interesting because they've reduced their unhoused population substantially over the last decade with a very punitive approach to doing so, with total eradication of unhoused people's encampments, no rights to sleep outside, even in warmer weather. And it's kind of fascinating to see how that works. That doesn't mean that people are getting into housing and staying in housing with these approaches. That just means there's less visible homelessness.
So they're just kind of getting caked into marginal
peripheral spaces. That's not to say that people aren't getting into housing. They are there in Houston. It's just a way more aggressive approach to removing people from visible public spaces. Yeah.
I see. So I wanted you to talk about your book a little bit. What motivated it, and what did you learn from it, and what are maybe some of the key take-home messages?
Yeah. So the book, The Injustice of Property, it just came out in July. So that came out of years of field work in Portland, Oregon, where I was working in unhoused encampments that were actually sanctioned by the city. And on city property almost all of the time. There are a few that are on church property, for instance, now, and every once in a while you'll see one on sort of a private property as well. But there was 4 that I was working in. They consider themselves self-managed, meaning that the city doesn't really do anything with them. There might be some light funding for porta potty cleaning and a fence around the perimeter to sort of protect it in a light sense. But other than that, they're self-managed. So the members themselves make the rules about the community. They establish a set of bylaws by which they govern themselves and make decisions about, who does what labor, who does security at night, mundane stuff like who's doing the dishes, who didn't do the dishes, and what punishment should be. But then ways of dealing with more complicated social things like, this person's been stealing things from people who was just let in a few weeks ago. We need to sanction this person, and what should that be? So using the democratic process to actually figure that out was really interesting to observe. So at a place called Right to Dream, they had members who live there, but then they also function as an overnight shelter. At any given night, there could be 50 guest sleepers at night. So there's a lot of people moving in and out of there, just sleeping on the floor under a big open tent. And, there's going to be some issues with people rubbing elbows, literally. But when there's a problem, Right to Dream will then sort of sit down in their weekly meeting and read out the allegation about whatever happened in front of the person. People who were affected will say, this is how I was affected. And, in these ways. I'm still affected. And this, I'd like for us to deal with this in a certain way. Allows the person who is alleged to have done something to say their end of it. And then there's a board there to sort of help convene and say, well, given our bylaws and this is what you've admitted to doing, you have to be removed from here for 48 hours or something like that. Sometimes there's a permanent ban for really egregious behavior. So seeing that sort of social system within the informality of these encampments was kind of eye-opening to me.
Like a self-organizing.
Yeah, there's a whole democratic process going on there that's mirroring the democratic processes that the city of Portland is doing, for instance. The one major downside to that is they don't have any legitimacy in terms of owning the space itself. So it's not stable long-term. They don't get the ultimate say. The city could always come in and say, we don't want you here anymore. You must go. And so in the book, I actually talk about how, for all the benefits of this self-organizing model, for this, how it helps pull people into democratic organizing, makes them feel good about themselves. It's a socialization process. And for chronically unhoused people, it's really helpful to do it at a peer level, not at the sort of weird level of going to a city hall and having the mayor sort of not even really think about what you're saying when you're complaining about your reality. And to then create the conditions of your own living environment. It was really beneficial. The downsides of that are the state will come in and take care of it when it doesn't like what the process is. And so one way that I saw that being limiting the agency of the people who are staying in these spaces was when they did need to sort of remove someone from the encampment for violence or harassment or antagonism, and the group has come together to vote them out and say, we just don't think you can be here anymore. It's not really a legal eviction. They're just telling someone to leave. And when they don't leave, that becomes a huge problem. Generally, these encampment communities are not calling on the police to resolve issues because the police can oftentimes kind of exacerbate situations for really vulnerable populations. So they try and figure out themselves. That can become a problem of just this sort of back and forth over time. So the limits to that is that eventually some of the decisions that these self-governing groups make are not actually able to be realized because of what I argue are regulations of property that actually keep these encampment communities limited in what their and how far that self-governance actually goes, so to speak. So yeah, that's kind of one idea that goes throughout the book. But the broader arc of the book is that property can be unjust in a lot of ways, not just for unhoused people, but for precariously housed people. I play a lot in the book about the concept of injustice and what that means, to talk about and empirically kind of talk through the stories of people that I was interviewing in Portland to show how property is unjust, specifically in their circumstances. And if we're to eradicate homelessness, we need to be thinking about the ways in which property is unjust, specifically for these unhoused people. So it's sort of one of the takeaways of the book is that homelessness will not change within liberalism because of how unjust property can be for the housing insecure. Which sounds so obvious when you say it on the surface, but it goes through a lot of that sort of conceptual work through the justice literature to get there.
How did you change your perspective on urban geography as a result of writing this book? What did you learn about yourself and the way you view urban geography?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think one way of thinking about that is that urban geography has not really addressed some of these issues in this way. I don't think that urban geography is really substantively engaged with justice as a concept. I think justice is
side effect.
Yeah, it's an intuitive understanding. And so when we say something is unjust, we all have this sense of what's good and what's bad, what's right and what's not fair. But there's 1,000 years of literature on justice that people don't really engage with the concept of why is something unjust or just. how do we make those claims about what is just or unjust? And how do we evaluate social and spatial circumstances that are unjust if we're not actually talking about these concepts? We're just saying that to me feels unjust, and therefore this is a problem. I don't want to attack anyone who has this sort of intuitive sense. Some of our best scholarship in urban geography comes out of the normative assertion, like this is wrong, this is why, capitalism, etc., has destroyed everything. There's really solid work that does that. All we're saying is that once you start to think about what justice as a concept can mean in all of these varied ways, we might have actually more specific accusations of injustice that then are attached to very specific political and legal solutions or mechanisms. And so we're sort of trying to narrow what we mean by that. So if I think about that in relation to how writing the book has changed that, I wasn't really thinking about the discipline when writing the book. But now if I think back on how what the lessons in this book might show is that urban geography is probably could be taking justice a little more specifically, a little more intentionally, as I just laid it out.
Sounds like you've got an epistemological basis for it, at least with 1,000 years of.
I hope so. Yeah.
You have you've heard about this abundance program. Ezra Klein talks about that, and you've probably also heard allegations that like most people who are homeless, they're on drugs or they got mental problems.
That's right.
And I wondered how much of what you hear about the sort of that public perception of the unhoused, how does that come about? Because you've seen it from the ground up, for most of us have not seen. So where does that come from, and does it have a basis, and what would you respond to people who bring up those issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. That comes out of a lot of things. There's interpersonal stigma towards others that, we just slight people when we don't understand them. Media plays a really large role in stigmatizing what our perception of unhoused people is. Federal administrations can come in and really change the way we think about marginalized, vulnerable populations, not just unhoused people, but more broadly. So I think there's a lot of things that have sort of collectively created this image of the unhoused who are drug dependent, mentally ill, and sort of left without any possibility of help or savior, so to speak.
Well, then we could use our silver bullet approach and just throw them away like some cities do, I think.
And this is the federal administration's new approach, and within a few days, this might be happening. So the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Agency will release its first kind of substantive take on how they want to change homelessness funding in this country.
Oh, okay.
Hasn't been listed yet, but some articles have said, like the New York Times had one a few days ago that said there will be more of a competition for funding now for homelessness services. And what that will be is they're tying in certain outcomes that they want to see, like there can't be any sort of race or gender specificity in the clients they're serving in the shelter system, for instance. And so therefore, what they call continuums of care, which are basically just local or regional agencies that tally up sort of census counts for unhoused people, but then also take federal funds and then put that into the network of social services in an area. They will have to compete now more so than they ever have for federal funding along the terms that the federal government is sort of identifying. And so it seems like what's going to be most problematic, from my opinion, is the sort of the forced therapizing aspect of federal funds now. And so meaning that people will be forced to go into treatment to receive any sort of help.
Instead of recognizing that there are layers of complexity that drive process.
Yeah, exactly. So I think to get back to the question about the stigma of unhoused people, that certainly exists. There's people on the street because of histories of mental illness, family discord, but all of that, I tend to argue, and from my perspective, is undergirded from economic relationship. People can't afford a place to be, And therefore, all of the social and psychological things that challenge people throughout their daily lives are a product of not having a place to be and have those problems exist within the walls of someone's safe space.
These problems get amplified. Then.
Exactly. Yeah. So we do see people on the street who are going through mental challenges and through substance abuse. But we don't see that other people doing that because they do it behind walls. And so it's a little bit harder to sort of prove that point to people when that's all they see of unhoused people. But I know many people who are, would acknowledge themselves. They don't have any substantive mental health issues that they go through that is a reason why they're unhoused. They don't use substances, never have. It's not a reason why they're unhoused. It's because they can't afford rent. Many people I've even found, older folks particularly, who have children, just choose not to burden their children as someone who can't really afford to be in a place of their own. They don't want to take up that space. And so I've met a lot of people like that as well. And so there's a lot of humble people out there that as well who are willing to sacrifice their body and living in the elements to not burden family.
All kinds of reasons and facets.
Oh, yeah.
Have you read Yoni Appelbaum's book?
Which one? I don't think so.
We'll talk about it after the show.
Yeah, okay.
I think I'd be love to hear your take on it. Yeah, it's about how the history of housing we've almost intentionally made the housing ladder harder over time. Mm-hmm. But anyway, we'll discuss about that over a beer or something.
Yeah.
If someone's listening to this podcast, a young person that's thinking about going to college or maybe thinking about going to grad school, or maybe they're just thinking about this is an interesting topic, what would you say to a person like that just to get their fingers in the game?
Yeah. I would say if you're going to Michigan State, take my Homeless and Housing in America class, ISS 205, Big Ideas, Spring 26. That should be a lot of fun, where we'll just talk through all of the nuts and bolts of homelessness and housing inequality in this country and how different people think about this within geography, but also within economics and social policy and political science. There's a lot of ways to get involved, academic and non-academically. There's a lot of organizations like the National Alliance to End Homelessness is a pretty robust organization headquartered in DC that puts on a lot of social events that span the sort of realms of how we approach homelessness through direct mutual aid, through social service providers, through academics, through think tank research. And so that's a big one. Academically, in geography, I would say homelessness hasn't been that robust of a concept. I think it's bigger in sociology and social work. And so there's some really famous books in geography, like Don Mitchell's 2003 Right to the City, The Struggle for Public Space, I think is the subtitle. It's kind of a classic, and it still holds up almost 25 years later, about why unhoused people struggle in the way they do in the kind of modern American city, or any liberal democracy you could probably equate that with. And what that means to lack a substantive right to urban space. So it goes through these themes of urban political geography, the legalization of property rights, and how that affects unhoused people. And so, yeah, there's a small world in geography, and of course the injustice of property.
All right.
Yeah.
Are there any local agencies like East Lansing or Lansing that you know of that assist the homeless?
Yeah. Actually, there's a place in Lansing called The Fledge, which actually does really sort of interesting work with unhoused people. It's just sort of whatever issue someone is experiencing. I don't think they're an official social service agency. And so I'm sort of a little reserved to say, what they do specifically with people. But I met the owner, and his approach is to try and meet people where they're at, whatever they might be needing in that moment. He's basically like connecting them to what they need. Of course, you can see that's really limited with a one-person staff. And so it's not like an overnight shelter or anything. But then there's shelters in the city as well They're actually about to, they're planning right now to open up a tiny home encampment in Lansing. So I've gone to a few of the meetings there, and I've reached out to the city to sort of help work in that process, that planning process that will take place over this next year. And so they want to open up an encampment with 50 to 60 people at the, like, maybe they're targeting fall of 26.
Okay.
And so, yeah,
Here.
yeah, that's right. So there are agencies around that are trying to help. Yeah.
Okay, and that's my last question. If there was one like geography insight or idea or thing that really resonated with you that you wanted to share with the whole world,
Yeah.
on billboards, what would that idea or that concept be that really resonated with you?
That's a great question. There's like different levels of abstraction to answer this. So like I was really turned on by Henri Lefebvre's work in the production of space. Made me think about space at this really complicated level. I'm not sure that's the best way to turn people onto geography. And so, the way I try and help people who are thinking through a problem like homelessness is to understand the sort of scale of the body. When I talk about homelessness and private property rights, we often talk about how unhoused people, like all people, need to be somewhere in this earth. We need to exist in space somewhere. And when we start to think about the complexity of private property rights, about what housing means as an exclusive space for people who don't have access, you start to realize that not all bodies are equally able to be in certain places. And so there's a basic geographic lesson in question there. Where are people to go then if there is no space for them? And I think that opens up quite a geographic imaginary about the politics of homelessness, about housing, the legality of and why we make legal norms around who can be where and where they cannot be at what times. And so I like to invite people in to think geographically about homelessness kind of in that way. A really basic understanding of we all need to exist somewhere, but we can't for particular reasons. And to extend those out and think deeply about them is kind of a fun way to do that.
It's a multi-layered problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I could put that on a billboard, but that's a good lesson.
Yeah.
Stephen, thank you for coming in today and sitting down with us to talk about your journey. I know you're going to stick around and chat with us about the Homeless Persons Memorial Day, but first let's take a moment for a word from our sponsor. At Michigan State University's Department of Geography, Environment, and Spatial Sciences, geography is more than just maps. It's a way of seeing the world, understanding patterns, connections, relationships, and changes across physical, human, and technological landscapes. Whether you're curious about using GIS, remote sensing, and drones to analyze the Earth's surface, or exploring how human societies interact with climate, land, and resources, or uncovering the spatial aspects of public health, urban planning, economic development, and environmental challenges, a degree in geography from MSU will open the door to a wide range of interesting and rewarding careers. Choose from a Bachelor's of Science concentration in Earth observation and geospatial analytics, physical environment and climate, or human environment and economic geography. Or tailor your path through human, physical, and regional geography courses with a Bachelor of Arts degree. At MSU Geography, you won't just study the world, you'll help shape it. Ready to map your future? Visit geo.msu.edu and talk with an academic advisor today. So, Stephen, today we're talking about National Homeless Persons Memorial Day. Do you know how that got started?
I want to say it was one of the national housing coalitions that wanted to have a remembrance for all of the people who pass away throughout the year who are unhoused when they do so. So we're talking maybe 1990-ish is when this started. Yeah. And every year it's on the solstice. I think part of that is because it's the longest night of the year to sort of evoke in one's mind about what it might be like to be outside for a long period of time throughout the night. But I suspect there's also some symbolism there with the darkness of life that can be homelessness. So on the solstice, they meet to sort of remember people, and then it's usually then a call to action as well to say, if you want to get involved with helping people, usually through direct aid, these are the local organizations that tend to do that work. But then there's other national ones that actually are in DC that kind of persistently lobby the federal government to change their budget allocation or whatever it is. Think about affordable housing or funding certain continuums of care like I talked about earlier. So yeah, it's a night of remembrance, but then sort of a call to action as well.
Do you feel like National Homeless Persons Memorial Day is something that gets attention, or do you feel like it needs some more light shed in that direction?
I don't think it gets a whole lot of attention. I think even on a local level, I know they're put on by small organizations, sometimes just individuals who are in the know, but there aren't like government entities out there on December 21st sort of rallying the troops. And so it's a pretty small thing that usually is put on by people who are impacted by homelessness themselves. And so it comes from this personal experience, whether for themselves or through loved ones, for instance. And the emphasis is, again, on people who passed away when they're homeless. Counties, most of the time, do document how many people pass away throughout a year who they suspect are unhoused when they do so. And that's part of this remembrance as well, is that, homelessness is an issue that there's a day-to-day a problem, but this is not how we also want our unhoused populations ending. We don't want someone's life to be ended out on the street.
Maybe it's a way to humanize people a little bit, since our legal structures kind of almost dehumanize a lot of.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a call to action and a way of understanding and humanizing, as you say, the issue. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you again, Stephen, for joining us today. And if folks are interested in learning more about your book or about National Homeless Memorial Day, where would you direct them?
So you can find the National Homeless Persons Memorial Day just by Googling it, and it will show up on a bunch of different sites. Local chapters would probably have a specific, hey, we're going to meet here on this day at this time to memorialize in a particular place. And so it would be easy enough to find on Google. In terms of my book, it's out on the University of Georgia Press in the Social Justice series.
Remind me the title again.
The Injustice of Property, Homeless Encampments, and the Limits of Liberalism. So you can find that on Georgia Press's website, which I can share a link with you for.
Great. We'll make sure to put that information in our show notes.
Thanks.
So that's a wrap for this episode. Thanks for listening to Today in Geography from MSU's Department of Geography, Environment, and Spatial Sciences. Be sure to subscribe and share, and join us next time as we continue exploring the people, places, and stories that shape the world around us.